Hello, friends. Today I'm going to do something a little different. So far, I've only looked at nonfiction books and titles on this channel, but I'm also a pretty big fiction reader as well, and I particularly am a fan of one Stephen King, which maybe is a surprise to you. I don't know, but I'm a pretty big fan of his work. I haven't read all of his 70 novels, but I've read quite a few of them, and this is not his most recent published book, but it's the most recent one I read, and I wanted to do a short review of it and see if there was any interest in more fiction glances at fiction work like this one. So this is called Revival. It came out in 2014, so recent in terms of King's corpus of work, which covers several decades. And so what I'll talk about is I'll just talk a little bit about the premise, a little bit about some of the themes, some things that I liked about it, and hopefully that'll give you a sense of whether or not this might be one for you. So the premise of this is pretty straightforward. It follows a main character named Jamie Morton, who at the beginning of the novel is a young boy. He's very small. And one thing that's kind of sets this novel apart in King's work is that it actually follows Jamie over the course of his life, essentially, about 5 decades of time, which is an unusual scope of time for a King novel. And honestly, it's something I liked about it. So we follow Jamie as he grows up and wrestles with a lot of questions about life and goes through a ton of life experiences. Particularly, there is this, and this will get into the themes a little bit, but particularly there's another character named Charles Jacobs, who is in another main character. I won't say too much more than that, other than the idea that King pulls on is this notion of the fifth business, which is actually a screenplay kind of Hollywood screenwriting term. But the fifth business refers to a character, almost a type of a tricksterish character. Think like a Loki or someone like that, who shows up over the course of a story and kind of interrupts things. They have a strange connection with maybe the main character that's not entirely clear at first. And this character, Charles Jacobs, actually shows up initially as the pastor of the town that Jamie Morton lives in, and and then there are interesting interactions with this character and how he shows up and intersects with Jamie's life over the course of the following decades is a major through line for the rest of the book. So that's really the premise, and that's really where King takes it. Is he plays on this really interesting relationship with Charles that Charles and Jamie have. And I won't say anything more than that because I want to just set up the premise a little bit. Now, in terms of the themes of the book, which I think is maybe the more interesting layer to get into here, the strongest theme is the theme of obsession and addiction. And King has talked pretty openly about his own on-again, off-again struggles with addictions to various substances in his life, so that clearly comes through in some of his writing here. But he kind of talks about both sides of the coin. He talks about like an obsession and a fanaticism, which comes out in some of the spirituality and religious themes in the book, because Charles Jacobs is a pastor at the beginning, and his fanatic kind of connections to things are really intriguing. But also, Jamie Morton struggles with addiction over the course of his life. And so he kind of plays off both sides of the coin through this particular relationship and through the things that Jamie Morton struggles through over the course of his whole life. The way that he fights with addiction and the way that he sees obsession show up in Charles Jacobs. It's fascinating, and it's a really gripping exploration of some of those themes. Another quick theme I'll mention is really the theme of purpose and nihilism, which is like fairly dark, but that's really part of what he's getting at here is there more to life than what we can see? Like if we could just pull back the curtain beyond what we can see, would there be anything there? What would we see? Would it terrify us? Or would it be encouraging and freeing? Or would it be nothing? You know, some of those questions are a lot of what's getting at. And so the title Revival, it's a great title. It gets at some of these themes about being revived from literal death or being revived from addiction, being freed from addiction. There's a great scene in the book of an actual like tent revival, which is, well, super disturbing in some ways, but it's great. It's a like great King, kind of classic King scene. I really loved that part of the book. So those are some of the themes building off of the premise. I really liked this book. In King's work, there's some people who would contend that his early stuff before his accident in 1999 is his better work, and they're skeptical of his later stuff. I fall a little bit more on that side. I tend to like his earlier things pre-1999 than his later work. This is very, in terms of his later work, this is one of my personal favorites of his later novels. Um, I wouldn't put it in, top 3 to 5 per se of his books, but I really, really liked it. It's unique. It stands out in its tracking of one life, of Jamie Morton's one life. One thing I love about King's writing are his characters. He draws out these vivid character portraits, and this is a strong example of that. I mean, Jamie is a fantastic main character. Charles Jacobs is a great, I don't want to say villain per se, that's too simplistic, but he's a great counterpart to the main character. And so if you like that kind of kingish characterization, it's here in spades. Which is, by the way, if you haven't explored King at all, that's one of the greatest things about his writing, in my opinion, is he paints these characters that you either love, or you love to hate, or you fear at a really visceral level. He evokes those feelings in characters so well, better than most other novelists that at least I have read. This is a pretty strong exploration of that, an example of that in his writing. And I really did like the themes. The themes that I just mentioned, I thought were very well explored, drew me in, and I loved following the trace of those themes through this one character, Jamie Morton's life. One more thing I'll mention before I wrap this short interview up, or the short review up, is the question of horror. A lot of people ask, I hear Stephen King's great. I don't like horror. Should I read this? This is a maybe on that. I would recommend, if that's strongly you, I would recommend you go to 11/22/63 first. That's one of the greatest books King has written in general, but it's also one of the least horror books that he's written. This falls somewhere. It's definitely not in the camp of like It or one of those kind of outright horror books. It has a couple somewhat grisly scenes in it, and it gets, especially in the last third, particularly the last act, the last third of the book, it gets into some horror, more existential horror, more kind of Lovecraftian horror, which is another thing that sets this one apart. It's much more influenced by Lovecraft than most of his other work. So it does get there, and it's more of that dread, existential dread, pulling on those themes of nihilism and purpose, than it is just outright creepy scares. Those are not so much in the book. So hopefully that gives you a sense of whether or not this would be something you could dip your toe into. If you really hate horror, if you really hate creeps, probably still wouldn't want to get this. But if you can entertain it, and if you can handle a little bit of that tension, which personally I love, which King fans love, this might be a great entry point for you into his work. And if you're someone who likes his earlier works like me, but are maybe a little skeptical of his later works, I would definitely recommend this because I think it is a little bit more reminiscent of some of that earlier stuff. So that's a little bit about Revival by Stephen King. Great novel. Found it really gripping, really entertaining, and got me thinking about some of those deeper themes. So if you enjoyed this, comment or let me know, and maybe I'll keep looking at some fiction books, but I'll see you for my next review.